Góðir gestir, býð ykkur velkomin á þennan viðburð öndvegisverkefnisins Heimsins hnoss, söfnefnismenningar, menningararfur og merking. Gestir þessa viðburðar eru sagnfræðingurinn Ewa Domanska og fornleifafræðingurinn Mary C. Bowdry, en báðar tilheyra þær alþjóðlegum hópi fræðimanna sem taka þátt að tengjast þessu verkefni beint. Fyrst í pontu stígur Ewa Domanska, en hún starfar sem prófessor í mannvísindum við Adam Mickiewicz háskólann í Poznan í Pólandi og auk þess sem hún gegnir stöðu gestaprófessors við Stanford háskóla. Ewa Domanska hefur stundað rannsóknir á kenningum og sögu sagnfræðinnar, en auk þess vel þekkt langt út fyrir mörk sagnfræðinnar, þar sem hún hefur verið afkastamikill höfundur á sviði pósthumanískra fræða og verið virkur talsmaður þeirra hreyfingar sem kallað hefur eftir afturhvarfi til hluta og hlutvæddari hugvísinda. Og í fyrirlestri sínum hér í dag, sem ber titilinn Vestige, mun hún ræða skuggamyndir líkama sem hurfu með öllu í kjarnorkusprengingunni í Hiroshima og efnisveruleika þessara skuggamynda. Og að lokum fyrirlestrunum mun okkur auðvitað bjóðast tækifæri á að varpa fram einhverjum spurningum. Professor Ewa Domanska, in the name of all of us partaking in the project, My Favorite Things, I welcome you to Iceland, and we're very happy to have you here today giving this lecture and of course participating in our project, so please take over.
Thank you very much for having me in this project, and thank you to Professor Magnusson who invited me, I think, on the premise that I did work on microhistories. On one hand, I was interested in return to things. I hope I would not disappoint you, but I have to confess that I moved a little bit. I hope I moved. When I was doing this research, I was a PhD student. Now I am moving to something else, but I am still interested in materiality, and it's going to be about materiality. But first, I would like to thank also to Andriy for setting all these organization matters. Thank you very much for your time, I also have to say that I am for the first time in Iceland, and you are so kind and so nice that I hope I will be back and have more time to explore this wonderful country. I would like to start my presentation with an anecdote. How it happened that I actually moved from my deep interest and love in narrativist philosophy of history, in people like Hayden White and Frank Ankersmith, and I started to be interested in materiality and in so-called real presence of things. I was invited to give a talk for a PhD conference, graduate students conference at Stanford in 2001, and I was talking about 6 theses on the archaeology to come. This was my talk for PhD students. You have to be kind of avant-garde, otherwise they would get very bored and disappointed. So I was trying to be very avant-garde, but still I was talking about my favorite thing, which is the ontology of human remains. But I was talking about narrative, textual, representational aspect of it. And one of my colleagues, Gustavo Politis from Argentina, got very angry, and he started to shout at me. And he said, "You know what? Come to Argentina and dig mass graves with me, and you will see what the dead body is really about." And he changed my life. He really changed my life. So when actually I was present during the exhumations, I realized what is the matter. The concreteness and all these problems with the body, not considered as a kind of textual representational phantom, but something which is out there and that requires our attention. So I am interested in material presence of the past. I am interested in real things. I am interested in the metaphysics of presence. I am a neo-essentialist, and I will explain what I mean by that. I would like to start my talk with this controversial statement by an environmental historian from the United States, John Robert McNeill, who said in one of his interviews, the tyranny of the text must end. Just keep it in mind for a moment. In this presentation, I will consider the ontological status of the remains of victims of the nuclear holocaust in Hiroshima. But before I will do that, I would like to explain the background of the story and talk a little bit how it happened that I became to be interested in this issue, because I think it is relevant to the abstracts that are going to be, that I've read, and the talks that are going to be presented tomorrow. In 2012, I did a very extensive research. I researched 300 periodicals, 1,200 issues of journals from the humanities and social sciences, trying to find out what is the condition of humanities, of the humanities and social sciences. I have no doubts that we are going through the paradigm change. And this paradigm change, and of course I'm talking about the avant-garde emerging fields in the humanities, social sciences. I'm not talking about dominant scene. But as we know, these avant-garde tendencies, these people who are icons of contemporary humanities, social sciences, they really push things forward. So what is this paradigm shift about? There is this discussion, as you perfectly know, about going beyond anthropocentrism, going beyond Western conception of life, of human being. It is associated with so-called post-secular term, which is a very interesting phenomena on its own. So I would say that whenever you encounter a prefix, bio, eco, phyto, which is about plants, right? Geo, neuro, necro, techno, zo, it means that you are in a new paradigm. Of course, I'm not saying that these issues have been not discussed. I'm talking about putting these issues that have been discussed, like things, animals, plants, environment, and so on and so forth, in a completely different context, in the context of the discussions of about going beyond anthropocentric worldview, going beyond Western worldview, secular, and so on and so forth. So the context completely changed. The terms, we can't talk about terms anymore because there are so many, I can't really follow them anymore, right? But definitely something happened in the late 90s. As you know, 9/11 is considered as the end of postmodernism, as a kind of symbolic act. And what is going on with this term since the late 90s is that there is a specific interest in relational approaches, flat ontologies, flat alternatives. For example, Bruno Latour's and his actor network theory. Ontological term, geologic, oceanic, scientific, cognitive. And what is of interest to us here, especially for this project, is this turn to think, turn to materiality in a different context, because it was already visible before. But right now, the new materialism is coming. Scholars like Karen Barat, who is bringing quantum physics to humanities. So the context is really changing, and we are really moving to a different, let's say, different platform, intellectual platform. But I must say that it's not enough. I just read 2 articles by two iconic scholars right now. One by Bruno Latour, the second one is by visionary anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, that you must read, because he's doing this shift also. And they are proclaiming a major change in worldview. So this paradigm shift is just an outcome of a major change which is related to our worldview. I became interested in so-called non-representational theory, which is the theory which was developed in social sciences, merging with geology and geography, where the scholars like Nigel Thrift were talking about focusing on practices rather than representations. So this is something that I would also recommend you to take into consideration when you are planning your PhD from theoretical point of view. So this is the quotation from McNeill. That was my motto, and as you see, he is trying to attract historians' attention to different kinds of archives. He's talking about soil archive, archive which is related to botany, and so on and so forth. Many different things. This is not the object of my discussion today, but this phrase, the tyranny of the text must end, might be a very interesting slogan to discuss, just to provoke our thinking. I just want to say that I am not advocating it. I am just interested in this kind of a very revolutionary, for me as a historian, statement, because it would push me in a completely different track. The other important factor which stimulated my research that I am going to present today is the forensic turn, which is related with the development of forensic archaeology, the development of forensic anthropology that have more and more work because of the mass killings and catastrophes, identifications of the body, and so on. And this forensic turn is really affecting humanities and social sciences, including history, because it is related to a so-called evidential shift. As you know, history was very much about memory and witness testimonies recently. Now the witness is somehow in a different position, but we are turning to evidences, the evidence which we understand in the framework of law and forensics, rather than in terms of humanities. And this is also a very interesting move because it's also affecting how we talk about historical sources and historical evidences. For example, I discovered that in some countries you don't use, historians do not use the term historical source at all. They use only the term evidence. We don't use the term evidence in Poland because it's so related to legal issues, right? So that's also interesting. And of course, I have to mention it to satisfy Professor Magnusson that because of this evidential turn, there is an open space to rediscover Ginsburg and his evidential paradigm in a new context, right? Because we are using it all the time in history, but still, this new context might give us different research questions. Yes, and one of the last things which are at the background of my research is this idea that if you really want to do innovative research, you have to focus on objects which are somehow strange, or, as Latour would say, disobedient, which means the objects of research which really resist expected interpretation, where you feel challenged to do research because, for example, you don't have proper intellectual instruments, you don't have theories, you just face a necessity to develop your own, let's say, analytical categories, your own theories to grasp that. And this is, as Latour would say, this is the best that could happen to you, but of course it's extremely difficult. Yes, I will skip this. Okay, so this is what happened to me since 2001. I was working on the ontology of the dead body and remains. And this is the book that was published in Polish. It is already translated into English. I hope to publish it in the United States somehow soon, just to let you know where we are. And this is exactly what I would like to talk about, which is in the second part of the book. So, very shortly, in this book I'm trying to develop a theory of so-called necrotic metamorphosis. So I'm interested in how human dead body and remains are morphing in different circumstances, and I investigate different situations, like the regular natural decomposition, turning human ashes into diamonds, or planting trees on human ashes. But this is what I am talking about today, how the atomic remains are becoming somehow implanted into the concrete because of the atomic explosion. I bump into this subject also because I'm interested in alternative, non-anthropocentric approaches to the past. And I'm interested in talking about issues that we historians are so familiar with. For example, witnessing the problem of witnesses, perpetrators, victims. But when I went to Hiroshima, I discovered that the status of the victim is not only related to human being, but also to trees. And this is because of Shinto religion, right? That the tree is a victim, and there is a special, in the museum of Hiroshima, there is a special tree doctor that takes care about these trees. There are 170 survival trees in Hiroshima. So this is something that you might take into consideration if you are talking about categories that's supposed to be obvious in history. But if you're actually doing some interesting case studies, maybe in non-European contexts, you will discover that they are not so obviously related to human beings only. There are some articles that I found interesting on this issue. So I was interested generally in the new figuration of victim subjectivity in Hiroshima. That's why the idea of the hibakusha, which is the victim that survived atomic bombing, which is not only human, but which is like a plant, a tree, was interesting to me. Do you know which tree was the most resilient, let's say, in Japan? Ginkgo bilboa. That testifies that the ginkgo is really a symbol of life and liveness, as you might know. Okay. So the purpose of my presentation would be to show that the nuclear holocaust is not unique only because it leads to the annihilation of the total annihilation of the body, but also because it allows us to talk about going beyond opposition between organic and inorganic, between human and non-human. And I am showing you, excuse me, I'm showing you the very interesting cartoon by Keiji Nakazawa, very famous manga, because discourse about Hiroshima in Japan was somehow forbidden in a way. So only popular culture and movies such as Godzilla, or which is a symbol of the atomic bombing. I'm speaking about the Japanese Godzilla, not American Godzilla. Would be able to present to the public or be used as a kind of working through instrument. So if you are interested in comic books, I really recommend you Keiji Nakazawa, introduction by Art Spiegelman, the author of the famous Mouse. As you see, this is already a problem set here, that one of the main characters of the book says, there are no bones. There are no bones, only ashes. So I will analyze the post-human condition of these organic remains as a state of adherence, something which is implanted, stick to the concrete, by introducing the notion of the trace imprint, the vestige, vestigium. And I'm interested in the question how we can actually treat the Hiroshima space. Is it a memorial site rather than, or should we talk about the archive of destruction? Is it a prefiguration of the apocalypse to come? How, speaking about the human ashes, imprinted in the concrete because of the atomic explosion, how this study might reveal some information about the condition of the human subject and the human body and its post-mortem existence. Now I would like to show a movie, but I don't know how to do it because it has to go from minute 2.
After falling for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together they started a nuclear chain reaction. Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
Thank you. And if we come back to slide number 19, sorry. Okay, so August 6, 1945, 15 a.m., the atomic bomb exploded above the ground, which is important, 580 meters above the ground, the temperature in the hypocenter would be around 3,000, 4,000 Celsius. So the zone of total destruction is 1.6 kilometers. At the time of the explosion, a crowd of people were staying in front of the Sumitomo Bank in Hiroshima, waiting for the bank to open. It was like 260 meters from the hypocenter, where the temperature was 2,000 degrees centigrade. So because of the explosion, the bodies of these people disappeared. And this is one of the documentation from December 45 that shows that the person who was sitting in the steps to the bank, this is what was left of this person. So this is another photo made a year later. So this was the trace of the human being that was at that time at the Sumitomo Bank. Because the shadow, or whatever we call it, was disappearing with time, in 1972 it was moved to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, and you can see it still there. Have you ever seen it? Maybe? No? Okay. So now a little sentence, a short sentence from Jean-Luc Nancy. What remains is also what resists the most. This is for me a very disobedient subject, which is the icon of the violence and mass killing typical for 20th century. On the one hand, we have the disappeared bodies in Hiroshima. On the other, we have the Sonderkommando Auschwitz famous photo of the bodies from Auschwitz. The problem for each mass killing, as you know, is what to do with the body. Well, the nuclear holocaust is the only mean of getting rid of the victim's body immediately. Of course, it was not intentionally. So the steps were moved to the museum, and in this exhibit, in this glass box, with the saying "human shadow etched in stone," and you can still see a little shadow there. So you can see it, and this is what I am going to talk about. So what we have here is the explanation. This is how it is said, that you have the fragment, the real fragment from the steps on the one hand. On the other, you have this very famous photo taken in 1946, and the description says. The description says that the place where the person was sitting became dark like a shadow. In Japanese and in English. I was consulting this narrative with my Japanese colleagues, and they said that actually the description is not very accurate, because it shouldn't be entitled as human shadow etched in stone, but rather a stone with human shadow. So I did a different translation with, of course, the help of my Japanese colleagues, and it says like that it was a human shadow, and this is going to be a problem for me in a moment. As you will see in this reconstruction, and this is usually how the scene is represented, that on these banks there was a person, presumably it was a man, sitting on the steps, but after a while it appeared that after research and looking through witness testimonies, the person was identified in 1996 as Mitsuno Ochi, who was a housewife and went to the bank just to withdraw some money. She was 42 years at that time, and the workers who were working at this site were saying that actually not all human remains were disappearing on spot. There were some remains, and the spot suggests that it was a shadow or a small woman. The interesting thing is that many other family members of a person who disappeared were claiming that actually the shadow belonged to their relatives. Now, the most interesting thing. It is not a shadow. And I completely changed my idea about what I'm dealing with when I was reading the book by Hugh Gusterson, People of the Bomb, who was talking about describing a little anecdote. He was talking to a physicist, saying that the bodies were vaporized, and the scientist said the bodies were not vaporized; they were carbonized. So the idea of carbonization of the body would be more accurate, and the scientist said something like that. This is the problem with non-scientists. You are so sloppy with details. And I realized that if I would stay only with humanistic interpretation, I will get stuck with the idea of the shadow. And this idea of the shadow brings me to all this very rich tradition of talking about shadows, which comes back to Greek philosophers, and I realized that I have to go into natural sciences. I have to consult the project with physicists, specialists in radioactive substances to move it forward. So so I become to be interested how to proceed with the literalization of the metaphor, because the shadow is a metaphor. Whenever you read humanistic interpretation of Hiroshima, you will bump sooner or later on this idea of the shadow, while in fact this is not a shadow, it is a spot. It is a spot, this is a dark spot where the carbon remains of human body were implanted into the concrete. And that's a completely different story, right? Because the shadow is one thing, and this implant, the vestige, if I would say, is a different thing. I also was interested, and I was talking to archaeologists, is it possible to identify where is it possible and impossible to identify the body or the remains? And of course, as we all know, at some point of the composition, especially when we talk about particles, it's impossible to talk about gender, it's impossible to talk about race. The identification is impossible, even if you are dealing with isotopes and all these very new techniques. So I was interested how we actually are becoming human, and how we can talk about different understanding of humanity when we are dealing with this kind of case. And of course, I understand that in the future we might have a different technique to research the concrete, but at least not now. And I become a little bit disappointed with the humanistic interpretation of Hiroshima, including the testimonial poetry. However, I'm not giving up, because, for example, these poems, very nice poems about Hiroshima shadows, were teaching me that actually we have two different kinds, black shadows and white shadows, which is also important. So drawing a distinction between white and black shadows is meaningful because for while white shadows call to mind photography, something that might be called photograms, the black shadow, this spot, is more about material, persistence, material presence. But it was not enough for me. When I went to Hiroshima, it took me months to ask the curators of the Hiroshima Museum to allow me to look at this document, which is the report from scientific analysis of this fragment of the steps, which was done in 2001. And what it says is that, in fact, there are some organic remains adhered in this concrete, but we don't know what is it. It might be plant, it might be human, it might be animal, right? So this is the only thing that scientific analysis could tell us about what this concrete, the granite material is about. So I ask myself, what I actually gather from this report. The stone steps contain matter of organic origin, which is adhered and fused with the surface. But of course, we can't determine if this is from person, an animal, or a plant. Excuse me. Yes, so I was interested in this idea of adherence, adhered material, condition of adherence. How this material, which is implanted, the organic material which is implanted in the concrete, also might be interpreted in the context of what geologists are talking about when they are researching a contact metamorphism, which means that if you implanted something in a stone, the structure of the stone is also changing. So that's why I think it was a very interesting case of how the adhered, implanted human material or biological organic material might change a chemical and mineral composition of the stone. So in light of all this thinking, I become very hesitant to limit my analysis to the realm of poetic metaphor of the shadow. It has become that I must invert the process of conceptualizing metaphor and try to neutralize this impulse to use metaphorical language to describe the phenomenon. Because also the idea of shadow somehow aestheticizes the horror. Okay? It might be objective aestheticization, but like in case of all representation, it is about aesthetics. It is mainly about the aesthetics of absence. And I was interested in how we can talk about presence. So I am less interested in this kind of spectral presence of the person who annihilated during the atomic explosion, and I am more interested in this imprint, which is still somehow preserved in a stone. And I'm coming to the end shortly. And of course, the idea of the imprint is a very interesting concept, not only in Western culture. Archaeologists, when you find this imprint from the old times, you get very excited because it shows how the people move and so on and so forth. But also, if we think about other contexts, we have imprints of Buddha steps, Gandhi steps, and not speaking about the famous footprint on the moon. So it is all about our humanity, the hand and the food, right? So I was thinking, yes, we do not, in case of this Hiroshima bank, we do not have hand, we do not have footprint, handprint or footprint, but we have something else which is still imprinted, and how we can talk about that. And I think that, of course, it has different layers, the idea of vestigium. I have to admit that I am not the most happy with the concept itself, because it brings a lot of, for example, Christian connotation, the vestigium Dei, the important trope in Christian religion, the veil of the Veronica. Well, we know that, but I couldn't find a better description of what I am talking about. So maybe you will help me. So this is how my ideas developed. When I was doing first research on desaparecidos in Argentina in 2001, so in my first article on human dead body and remains, I used the Greimassian square to transcend the opposition between present and absent. And I was talking about non-absent past as a kind of description of how the bodies of desaparecidos are treated in Argentina. However, this kind of trace that I was examined has a slightly different appearance. I would say that this is a trace, the imprint, which is very resilient. It's like passive-aggressive, I would say. It's more about presence than about absence, and it's very difficult still to grasp. But still, I was thinking, how can I, for example, develop the idea of causative trace, which is something which when you press, it leaves traces, from the Latin cudere to hit. Okay, so this would be the last one of the last slides. So when we are dealing with the human shadow etched in stone, it demonstrates that the shadow itself might disappear over time, and we are not going to be able to see it, while the structure, the chemical composition of the stone will be still transformed. So how to talk about this disintegrated organic remains from very long time period? I'm not talking about short time, but I'm talking about like long durée, from the point of view of geologic time. And we know from the discussion about Anthropocene that actually one of the major anthropogenic change caused by humans that are visible, traceable in geologic strata are the atomic explosions. So how we can somehow connect the discussion about anthropogenic changes with this kind of traces, like the human shadow etched in stone? I think that this case, Hiroshima, is not only the inaugural postmodern act, as it was called, but it is the inaugural act of a new geologic epoch. It is related with Anthropocene, and it might be called the posthuman act. It pushes us beyond anthropocentrism. The comments collected here confirm that the past and its traces are too rich to be left exclusively to humanist reflection, as archaeologists have realized, of course, long time ago. For it is they who are invested in the material presence of the past presence, which is so often passed over by historians who continue to dwell on its absence. So my idea is that my colleagues historians are very preoccupied with what is no longer there, and are looking for this traces of something which is not there, while I was trying to find out how we can focus on cases that helps us to push history beyond text, beyond humanities, beyond human, and also encourage us to build a completely different understanding what we mean by human remains, and how we can deal with the preservation of human remains while they are existing in this kind of condition of adherence. Thank you.